This is the reason your brain can turn a person you were crazy about yesterday into someone you can't stand to be touched by today. People call it the ick, and a 2025 study found it is not pettiness or a personality flaw, but an ancient disgust system that first evolved to keep you away from disease and was later co-opted to help you choose a mate, firing off a rapid incompatibility alert before your conscious mind has caught up. Today we are going to break down exactly what the ick is, where it comes from, what the science actually says about who gets it and why, and whether you should trust it or fight it. We will do it using real research, a peer-reviewed study, evolutionary psychology, and the strange cultural history of a word that everyone now uses but almost nobody understands. Let's start with what the ick actually is. Brian Collison, Eliana Saunders, and Chloe Yin, 3 researchers from the Department of Psychology at Azusa Pacific University, put out a paper in 2025 in the journal Personality and Individual Differences. They titled it The Ick, Disgust, Sensitivity, Narcissism, and Perfectionism in Mate Choice Thresholds. And as far as the research goes, this stands as the first peer-reviewed study to examine the ick as a named phenomenon and dig into the psychology behind who experiences it. Their definition goes like this. The ick is a sudden and visceral aversion to a romantic partner, often triggered by behaviors or characteristics that superficially signal incompatibility or low mate quality. Strip away the academic language, and the authors described it in an interview as essentially an involuntary feeling of revulsion towards an individual from a certain action or behavior. It can happen in an instant, and seemingly out of nowhere. That is the part that matters. You do not choose it, it hits fast, and the trigger is often something tiny, something that on paper has nothing to do with whether this person would actually make a good partner. Once participants in the study were given a definition of the ick, 64% reported experiencing it, which puts the number at close to 2 out of every 3 people in the sample. This is not some rare quirk, and here is where the puzzle deepens. The ick often fires over something trivial, yet the body responds as if the stakes were enormous, and watching someone trip or chew strangely or send an awkward text can flip a switch that proves nearly impossible to flip back. Answering that means going back, way back, to the system running underneath the whole thing. Disgust. According to the researchers, the ick grows out of one of the oldest emotional systems we carry, disgust, and it does not materialize from thin air. As the lead authors put it in an interview, the ick stemmed from the evolution of disgust as a protective mechanism. First it was against disease, and then it was in mate selection to help individuals avoid undesirable traits. This aversion was always present. The only difference is that this generation gave it a name. That single quote carries the entire story, so let's unpack it. Disgust, in evolutionary terms, started as a disease response. Back in 2001, researchers Valerie Curtis and Adam Berrien published work arguing that disgust is essentially built into us, that the things which reliably disgust human beings map closely onto the sources of infectious disease, rotting food, bodily fluids, anything carrying the risk of infection. Disgust functions like a behavioral immune system, an early warning reflex that pushes you away from what could make you sick before it ever gets a chance to. Rats feel something similar. Later work described disgust as a pan-mammalian adaptation, meaning it predates modern humans entirely, and even rats show a disgust-like response after eating bad food, a reaction that depends on a region of the brain called the insular cortex, the same kind of neural machinery involved when humans feel disgusted. The disgust system is old, older than our species. In 2009, researchers Joshua Tybor, Dever Lieberman, and Vladis Griskevicius published an influential model proposing that disgust actually does 3 different jobs, which they called the 3 domains of disgust. Pathogen disgust comes first, the work of avoiding infectious microorganisms, and that is the original disease avoidance function. Sexual disgust follows, the work of avoiding sexual partners and behaviors that would jeopardize your long-term reproductive success. Moral disgust rounds out the trio, the work of avoiding people who violate social norms. Disgust began as a system for avoiding sickness, but evolution is a tinkerer, not an inventor, and it takes machinery that already exists and repurposes it. The same circuitry that once said don't eat that, it's rotten, got co-opted to say don't mate with that, it's risky. And the Collison study describes this directly. Disgust was originally adapted to protect against disease, and was later co-opted to regulate mate selection and social behavior. What you feel is the ick may be a very old alarm system, one built for survival, being pointed at a modern dinner date. Which brings us to a harder question. An anti-disease system should not need to reject a potential partner over something as minor as the way they hold a spoon, yet it does. And to understand why, we need to talk about the logic of rejection itself. When you evaluate a potential partner, your mind runs a screening process with a very particular bias built in, and the researchers connect the ick to something called error management theory, developed in part by Marty Haselton and Andrew Galperin. Choosing a mate opens the door to two kinds of mistakes. A false positive means accepting an incompatible partner, and in evolutionary terms, that mistake can be extremely expensive, draining your resources, reducing your reproductive success, and carrying long-term consequences. A false negative means rejecting a partner who actually would have been fine, a missed opportunity for sure, but one that poses fewer immediate risks. Those two errors do not cost the same, and the theory argues that our minds evolved a bias toward rejection when in doubt. Over evolutionary time, walking away from a maybe good partner proves safer than committing to a maybe bad one, which meant we became especially reactive to any trait that might hint at incompatibility. The study ties this to another well-established idea, that people are generally more attuned to potential losses than to equivalent gains. We notice what might go wrong more sharply than what might go right, and even a minor aversion can act like a protective tripwire, making you reject someone before you invest any further. Mate choice thresholds is the phrase the researchers use for this. Picture a threshold as the minimum bar a partner has to clear before you will even consider them. And even if someone carries a whole list of desirable traits, a single attribute falling below that threshold can trigger rejection. One thing is all it takes. That is the ick in a nutshell, your threshold system slamming the gate shut over a single cue. Sometimes meaningful and sometimes, as we will see, just someone chasing a ping pong ball. Which brings us to the actual study, the numbers, the people, and what they found. The method itself deserves attention before we get to the results. Two parts made up the research. A pilot study built on TikTok came first, and on May 12, 2022, the team pulled the first 100 TikTok videos tagged with the hashtag the ick, throwing out 14 videos that had nothing to do with dating and leaving 86 videos to analyze. These were not obscure clips. Each video averaged 3.27 million views, more than 500,000 likes, and around 7,000 comments. And in the paper, the authors note that on TikTok, the hashtags for the ick had amassed over 1 billion views. An Instagram account called What Gives You the Ick curates examples too. From those 86 videos came 157 separate icks sorted into categories, and 78% of those videos centered on icks experienced by women, while 22% centered on men. That pilot study revealed what kinds of things people actually call icks, and the team used those findings to build the main study. Amazon's Mechanical Turk supplied 125 single adults for the main survey. The group broke down to 59% men and 41% women, ranging in age from 24 to 72 with an average age of about 39, and participants completed established psychological measures for disgust, perfectionism, and narcissism to see which personality traits lined up with getting the ick. The authors flagged one limitation themselves. Their final sample of 125 came in just under the number their own statistical plan called for, which was 134, so they say the results should be interpreted with some caution, and that kind of transparency makes a study more trustworthy, not less. So what did all of this reveal? Let's start with the split between men and women. Clear differences emerged between men and women, though maybe not the ones you would expect. Familiarity with the term came first, before they were even given a definition. 63% of women were already familiar with the phrase the ick, compared to only 39% of men. Experience came next. 75% of women reported having experienced the ick, versus 57% of men. Women were more likely to know the term and more likely to say they had felt it. But here is where it gets subtle. When it came to how often people got the ick, the frequency, no significant difference showed up between men and women. On the actual rate of experiencing it, men and women came out about the same. And when everyone rated their general likelihood of getting the ick, again, no significant gender difference. The gap lives in familiarity and in whether people had experienced it at all, not in how frequently it strikes. Parental investment theory sits on the biological side of the explanation. The idea that because women historically carried a greater reproductive investment, they may be more attuned to signals of incompatibility or low mate quality. As one of the authors put it, from a biological standpoint, women may experience it more because of parental investment. The researchers were careful not to make it purely biological, though. The same author continued, however, social media is like a loudspeaker that amplifies to create normalization. The ick shows up more in the kind of media that women tend to consume more of, and that visibility may amplify and normalize it. A matching finding backs this up. When the authors ask younger versus older generations about the ick, their take was that younger generations are not necessarily experiencing something different. In their words, rather than younger generations experiencing the ick differently, it's more so that they have just coined the term to describe it. Same old feeling, new name. Familiarity was not the only difference between men and women in the study. Different things set them off too, and that brings us to the triggers. Everyone wants to know what actually gives people the ick. Women's icks from the TikTok pilot study sorted into categories, and the single most common at 40% was something labeled gender incongruent, behavior seen as overly feminine. The example given in the study was, quote, "When he laid his head on my shoulder." Publicly embarrassing behavior ranked next at 28%, with the example shazamming a song in a nightclub. Annoying speech followed at 22%. Further down the list came fashion missteps, and the study literally lists "he wore jorts," meaning jean shorts, plus misogynistic behavior. Physical appearance accounted for only about 6% of women's icks, so in this data, looks were a relatively minor trigger for women. Behavior and personality cues dominated. When women rated how likely specific things were to actually give them the ick on a scale of 1 to 5, misogynistic behavior and annoying speech scored highest, both around 4.1 out of 5, while physical appearance scored much lower. The strongest icks for women were not about how someone looked, but about how someone behaved. Men told a different story. On TikTok, the most common category of men's icks, at 29%, was being overly trendy, with the example given as into astrology, followed by publicly embarrassing behavior and annoying speech. When men rated their likelihood triggers, physical appearance came out on top, scoring about 3.15 out of 5 along with vanity. Women's strongest icks tended to be about behavior, while physical appearance carried more weight for men, a genuine contrast between the sexes. Some triggers point to something real. Misogyny ranked among women's top-rated icks, and that is not trivial at all but a legitimate red flag. Others are, by the study's own description, superficial, and the paper points to examples like awkwardly chasing a ping-pong ball, licking their finger before turning a page, or posting polls to Instagram story, none of which have any clear bearing on whether a relationship would actually work. That tension between the ick as a real warning and the ick as a meaningless overreaction is exactly what the personality findings dig into. 3 personality traits sat at the heart of the study: disgust sensitivity, narcissism, and perfectionism, each tested to see which ones predicted getting the ick. Disgust sensitivity comes first, your baseline tendency to feel disgusted by things, and this is the big one. The study's central finding puts it plainly. Greater disgust sensitivity was associated with both the likelihood and frequency of experiencing the ick. The correlation between disgust and general ick likelihood ranked among the strongest in the whole study, which makes complete sense given everything we have covered. If the ick grows out of the disgust system, then people whose disgust systems are more sensitive will trip that alarm more easily. As the authors put it, heightened aversion to minor partner cues may shape where you set your rejection threshold. Narcissism comes second, specifically grandiose narcissism, an inflated sense of self-importance and a need for admiration. Here the finding grows more precise. Narcissism linked to the likelihood of experiencing the ick but not to how often, meaning narcissistic people were more likely to get the ick without necessarily getting it constantly. The interpretation is selective reaction. They might only get the ick when they perceive a very specific flaw that threatens their high opinion of themselves or their partner's status. Disgusted not by every little thing but by the things that dent the image. Perfectionism comes third, specifically other-oriented perfectionism, meaning holding other people to excessively high standards. This one linked to both the likelihood and the frequency of getting the ick, and that difference matters. Unlike narcissism, which showed up selectively, perfectionism ran deeper. Rigid, idealized standards for a partner mean less tolerance for minor imperfections, more noticed flaws, more reactions, and more icks. As the study puts it, people with rigid standards experience the ick more frequently. Sensitive disgust systems inflated expectations of yourself, rigid perfectionistic standards for others. Put those 3 together and the people most prone to the ick start to take shape, which leads to a genuinely uncomfortable question the researchers themselves raise. Is the ick actually protecting you or is it sabotaging you? The real controversy sits at the center of this research, and the authors are refreshingly honest about not having a final answer. Is the ick adaptive, a useful survival tool, or is it a bias that makes you reject perfectly good people? The case for usefulness lines up with error management theory. Your mind is wired to avoid making mistakes, and the ick can act as a rapid rejection mechanism, letting you disengage from someone before you invest too much. Some icks clearly flag real problems, and misogyny was one of women's top-rated triggers. The case for bias is just as strong. As one of the authors said, there is an indication that the ick is less about genuine incompatibility and more about unrealistic expectations and deviation of an ideal partner. The correlation with perfectionism and narcissism suggests that a lot of icks are not warning you about a bad partner at all, but reflecting your own impossibly high standards. The author summed up the double-edged nature of it. It is both, depending on the context. On one hand, it aligns with error management theory, in which an individual is wired to avoid making mistakes. On the other, it can also be a cognitive bias, since it is less about genuine incompatibility. Social media may be amplifying the whole thing too. When people constantly share and rank their icks online, it can normalize hyperselectivity, encouraging people to adopt aversions that have no real bearing on compatibility. Mate choice copying describes this, where people absorb other people's preferences instead of forming their own, and TikTok may not just be describing the ick, but spreading it. The science lands on a split verdict. Sometimes the ick is your ancient background check catching a real problem, and sometimes it is just noise, an overreaction dressed up as instinct. That leaves the practical question. What are you actually supposed to do about it? If you get the ick, should you trust it? The study does not hand you a clean answer, and that is honest because the answer depends on the context, but the researchers did offer real guidance. Brian Collison put the dilemma bluntly. You could reject a really great person over a superficial trait, or you could be tapping into something that could be a problem later on. That is the razor's edge. Sometimes the trivial thing really is trivial, and sometimes a small behavior is a snapshot of something bigger. People overwhelmingly handle the ick in the same, slightly counterproductive way. They talk about it to everyone except the person who caused it. In the study, 92% disclosed their ick to someone. 80% told friends, 50% told family, 39% even told coworkers, but only 28% told the person who actually gave them the ick. As Collison observed, the vast majority of people are talking about their icks to everybody except for the person eliciting the ick. His suggestion was to consider flipping that, to actually raise the concern with the person, awkward as that conversation might be, rather than just venting to your friends. The ick is not always a relationship death sentence either. 26% of people in the study ended the relationship immediately after getting the ick, and another 42% stopped dating the person at some later point, but 32%, nearly a third, kept dating despite the ick. For a lot of people, it is a feeling they were able to sit with, examine, and move past. Pause before you act. That is the takeaway from the research. Ask whether the ick is pointing at something that would genuinely matter down the line, or whether it is just your threshold set impossibly high over something that does not. So let's bring it back to where we started. Random is how the ick feels, like a glitch, a sudden involuntary shutdown of attraction over something you cannot even fully explain. According to the research, it is not random at all, but the surface expression of an ancient system. Disgust evolved first to keep our ancestors away from disease, and then that same machinery was co-opted to help them screen potential mates. When you get the ick, some very old circuitry runs a background check on the person in front of you and flags a possible incompatibility. Sometimes rightly, sometimes not. Collison, Saunders, and Yin's 2025 study gave us the clearest look yet at who feels it and why. People high in disgust sensitivity, narcissism, and perfectionism are more prone to it. Women are more familiar with it and more likely to have felt it, though it strikes both sexes about equally often, and the triggers range from genuine red flags like misogyny all the way down to chasing a ping pong ball. Maybe that is the most human part of all this. The feeling has always been there. As the researchers said, this aversion was always present, and the only difference is that this generation finally gave it a name. Cavemen never called it the ick, but their bodies were running the exact same check. The next time attraction flips to revulsion over something small, you will at least know what is happening under the hood. It is not pettiness. It is a 200,000-year-old alarm system doing its job. The only question left is whether, this time, it is actually right.